Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a truly staggering geopolitical analysis of an event that, frankly, shocked the entire globe. The midnight raid in January 2026 that actually resulted in the capture of a sitting president. We're going to break down exactly how this raid went down, examine the official justifications we were all given, and then, most importantly, dig into the underlying economic and geopolitical data the source material presents, because that data tells a fascinating story about why this really happened. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. The 2026 Caracas Raid, Anatomy of Operation Absolute Resolve. So let's dive into this unprecedented military operation detailed by our source, which honestly feels straight out of a Hollywood thriller.
The capture of Nicolas Maduro absolutely wasn't a spontaneous act. It was a meticulously planned mission that took months. As early as August 2025, a CIA team was on the ground tracking his exact movements. By November, the U.S. president delivered a direct ultimatum over a phone call, and when that was refused, the U.S. military literally built a replica of the presidential residence in Kentucky just to rehearse the raid. Finally, after a few weather delays, the operation got the green light on January 2nd, launching a massive armada of 150 military aircraft. The source breaks down this incredibly swift execution into 4 main phases. They kicked it off with a cyber attack to plunge the entire capital into darkness. That was immediately followed by airstrikes to completely blind radar and air defenses. Once the skies were clear, Delta Force commandos swept in on helicopters, skimming just 100 feet above the ocean to stay under the radar. Within 5 minutes, just 5 minutes of breaching the residence, the target was captured, whisked away to a Navy ship, flown to Guantanamo Bay, and ultimately brought to a military base in New York.
Section 2. The official narrative justifying the midnight raid. Now, how exactly does a nation justify such a massive breach of international norms?
Well, the analysis lays out the official reasoning. Sure, proponents argued it was about restoring democracy and human rights, but the core legal justification? That leaned heavily on combating international drug trafficking. The specific charges out of the Southern District of New York against Maduro and his wife include narco-terrorism and cocaine importation conspiracies that supposedly date all the way back to 1999. The official narrative was basically framing this as a massive, high-stakes law enforcement operation against a drug cartel. Section 3. Claim versus evidence, analyzing the drug allegations. And here is where our source makes a really crucial pivot, holding those official drug claims up against expert data. When you look at the raw numbers, the official U.S. indictment claims Venezuela was shipping around 200 to 250 metric tons of cocaine a year. But contrast that with expert data, say from Guatemala, which exported roughly 1,400 metric tons in 2018 alone. The source uses this glaring disparity to ask a really logical question. If this military action was strictly about stopping the volume of drugs, why target a relatively minor transit hub and completely ignore vastly larger exporters? It gets even more interesting when the analysis brings in reporting from the New York Times to contrast the actual transit routes. It turns out cocaine passing through Venezuela is predominantly shipped to Europe, largely because they don't even have a Pacific coast. Meanwhile, the Pacific route, springing from places like Colombia, Guatemala, and Mexico, is the primary artery pumping drugs into the United States. So again, this data really challenges the idea that Venezuelan trafficking was an existential threat specifically to American borders. Which leads to this massive, lingering question posed by the source. We all know the leading cause of American overdose deaths today is fentanyl, right? And fentanyl is primarily manufactured in Mexico using chemicals from China. Venezuela essentially has zero known role in that specific trade. So if preventing American drug deaths was the actual goal, why was this unprecedented taxpayer-funded military raid launched against Caracas, instead of targeting where the fentanyl's actually coming from? Section 4. The true motive. The economics of crude. According to the analysis, the real driving force behind this whole geopolitical earthquake wasn't drugs at all. It was oil. 303 billion. Let that number just sink in for a second. That represents Venezuela's proven barrels of crude oil reserves. It's the single largest reserve in the entire world. It literally eclipses oil giants like Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the US itself. This one data point completely shifts the context of this whole situation from a simple law enforcement issue to a massive play in resource economics. To really underscore this economic driver, the source highlights a very telling quote made by the U.S. president the day after the operation. He called the situation in Venezuela the greatest theft in the history of America, specifically adding, "They took oil away from us."
The source argues that this phrasing, framing a sovereign nation controlling its own natural resources as stealing from the US, is a huge tell about the true resource-driven intent behind the raid. Now, to understand how we got to that quote, we need to trace the escalating friction over this oil. Oil was discovered there way back in 1922, and American corporations quickly moved in. But the tide turned. In 1976, Venezuela set up its state-owned oil company, and the real game changer was the 2001 hydrocarbons law, which formally nationalized the reserves and pushed foreign corporations out. This friction basically boiled over in 2019 when the U.S. imposed heavy sanctions, blocking Venezuelan crude exports and crippling their production, despite them sitting on a fifth of the world's total reserves. Section 5. Geopolitics of heavy crude, a refinery mismatch. But wait, you might be wondering, why does the U.S. even care about Venezuelan oil when America produces so much of its own?
Well, the missing piece of the puzzle is the physical difference in the oil itself. U.S. crude oil is what's called light and sweet. It's great for making petrol, but Venezuelan crude is heavy and sour, which is exactly what you need to produce diesel, asphalt, and heavy industrial fuels. Here's the kicker. A massive chunk of American refineries, built back in the 70s, were specifically hardwired to process that heavy, sour Venezuelan crude. Without it, a vital part of the U.S. energy infrastructure is essentially stranded, driving up industrial fuel costs and messing with supply chains across the country. And to add a little more fuel to the fire, let's look at where Venezuela's limited sanctioned oil output is actually going today. The data shows that China is currently buying up 68% of Venezuela's oil. So not only is the U.S. cut off from a resource its refineries desperately need, but its primary global economic rival is swooping in and securing the lion's share of it. The source argues this incredible economic and strategic tension is what truly triggered the entire operation.
Section 6. The International Order, Global Reactions and Consequences. Finally, let's examine what this means for international law when a superpower just forcibly extracts a foreign leader. As the explainer details, the fallout was immediate and massive. First off, the operation outright violated UN Charter Article 2.4, which explicitly forbids using military force against a sovereign nation. The UN Secretary General condemned it immediately. Back in the US, it completely bypassed mandatory congressional approval, sparking a huge legal uproar. And internationally, critics are literally calling this New Age colonialism, using raw military might to just swoop in and seize foreign resources. The sheer gravity of the situation is captured perfectly in this joint statement from Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, Spain, and Uruguay. Notice they aren't defending the specific leader who was taken. They are defending this system itself. They warned that this is a dangerous precedent for a rules-based international order. It really highlights this profound growing fear globally that the established rules of sovereignty are just being ripped up and thrown away. So, as we wrap up this analysis, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought from the source material. If international law can just be bypassed, and military might alone dictates who controls the world's most valuable resources, are we actually entering a new world order? I mean, where does a nation's sovereignty end and a superpower's interests begin? It's a complex, honestly unnerving question, but one that's absolutely going to define our global future. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and as always, keep questioning what you see.